Chapter 8, Section 1, Washington takes office. As I read through this section, if you need to pause, if you need to go back and replay any part, you are more than welcome to do that. So, Washington takes office. Why it matters. In 1789, the American people had a new constitution. They also had a new Congress and their first president. The United States was 1/4 its size today. All 13 states were in the east. The nation's western border followed the Mississippi River. In the north, the Great Lakes formed much of the border separating the United States from the British-controlled Canada. In the south, the United States bordered on Spanish-controlled Florida and Louisiana. Section focus question: how did President Washington set the course for the new nation? The first president. In April of 1789, George Washington traveled from Virginia to the nation's capital, New York City, to begin his term as the first president of the United States. Washington's journey along bumpy roads took 8 days. Large crowds lined the streets. As one newspaper reported, Americans greatly admired the tall, stately war hero. Many persons in the crowd were heard to say they should now die contented, nothing being wanted to complete to their happiness but the sight of the Savior and of his country. And that was a Gazette of the United States in April 1789. Washington's inauguration, which is a ceremony in which the president takes the oath of office, was held on April 30th, 1789. Despite all he had achieved, Washington was anxious. The country was divided on many issues. Washington understood how much the new nation depended on him. His actions would set a precedent or an example to be followed by others into the future. The executive branch. The Constitution of the United States provided only a general outline for organizing the government. When the president took office, the entire federal government was made up of little more than 75 post offices, a few clerks, and a tiny army of 672 soldiers. The first job of the president and of Congress, therefore, was to put a working government in place. First, Congress passed laws to set up 3 departments for the executive branch: Treasury, State, and War. Each department was to be headed by a secretary nominated by the president. The president would also appoint an attorney general to advise him on legal matters. Washington appointed 4 well-known men to take the posts. He chose Alexander Hamilton to be the Secretary of the Treasury. These are some pieces that are definitely noteworthy to get. So we've got Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton was considered one of the country's outstanding leaders and an expert on economic affairs. Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, became the Secretary of State. His task was to manage relations with foreign countries. Henry Knox, a former general, was Washington's choice for Secretary of War. And if you know of Fort Knox, that's where we get that from. Edmund Randolph, who had played an important role at the Constitutional Convention, became the Attorney General. Washington soon began meeting regularly with these leaders as a group. Over time, this group became known as the Cabinet. So as a whole, those are those important people. The Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson. Secretary of War, Henry Knox. Attorney General, Edmund Randolph. Some other important first people: President, George Washington. And I believe we'll have one more we're going to stumble upon. We'll just set that aside, though, for now. Establishing the judiciary. The Constitution also called for a judiciary or a court system. The Judiciary Act of 1789 provided for a Supreme Court of 6 justices. Under the Supreme Court were 3 circuit courts and 13 district courts. The main job of the federal courts was to hear appeals from the state courts. Washington appointed John Jay of New York as the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. That'd be a good one to have. John Jay. So, what were the new executive departments? I believe we still have even one more we might be adding here. But those are all of them. Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of State, Secretary of War, Attorney General, and First Chief Justice. The nation's first economic crisis. The American Revolution had left the nation deeply in debt. The federal government owed $52 million. That debt was mainly in the form of bonds. A bond is a certificate issued by a government for an amount of money that the government promises to pay back with interest. Both Americans and foreigners had invested in bonds to help the war effort. Would the government pay back this debt? The issue is complicated because most of the people who had originally bought the bonds had sold them for less than they were worth. The buyers were speculators or people who invest in risky venture in the hope of making a large profit. It seemed unfair to many Americans that speculators would make a profit after the original bond owners had lost the money. Also in dispute was whether or not the federal government should pay back state debts. The government was operating on a shoestring, meaning they don't have much money. It did not even have the money for George Washington's move to New York. Washington had to borrow $3,000 to pay his moving expenses. Checkpoint. Why was there such a large public debt? So this is the cost of money it cost to run the government in 1789 to 1791, the amount of money the United States owed, and the total income that they received. That total debt is over $81 million. And this is a brand new nation. So, Hamilton makes up the financial plan. Remember, he is the Secretary of Treasury here. The person responsible for developing a plan to solve the country's financial crisis was Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton's program had 3 parts. 1, the U.S. government would fully assume or agree to pay all federal and state debts. 2, the U.S. government would charter a national bank for depositing government funds. And 3, the government would impose a high tax on goods that are imported into the country. Paying the debt. Hamilton knew that paying the debt would be a huge burden on the U.S. government. However, he warned to prove people here and abroad that the United States would honor its debt in full. Then people would be willing to invest again in the future. Many Southerners opposed the plan to repay the state debts. Several Southern states had paid off their wartime debts on their own, and Southerners thought other states should have to do the same. Congress debated the plan for 6 months in 1790. Then an agreement was reached. Southerners would support Hamilton's plan to have the federal government repay the wartime debt. In return, the government would build its new capital city in the South. The capital would rise along the banks of the Potomac River between Virginia and Maryland. Right now, right here, we start to see a crack in our very, very new nation. We have the North versus the South who have very different ideas of what the country should do, but they make a compromise. They say, okay, and the capital is going to be in the South. But this divide is going to grow deeper as we go. The National Bank. The second part of Hamilton's plan called for the creation of a privately owned bank of the United States. It would provide a safe space to deposit government funds. The bank would be able to issue paper money that would serve as a national currency. The debate over the Bank of the United States went beyond the bank itself and focused on the powers the government had under the Constitution. Opponents of the bank, such as Thomas Jefferson, insisted that the law establishing the bank was unconstitutional, or it is contrary or opposite to what is permitted or allowed by the Constitution. Jefferson argued that nowhere in the Constitution was there a provision, or there was no thing that allowed Congress to set up a national bank. Jefferson's view that the Constitution permits only what it specifically says is called a strict interpretation, meaning if it's not in there word for word, it's not allowed. Hamilton argued for a loose interpretation. He pointed out that Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gave Congress the power to make all laws necessary and proper for fulfilling its duties. This suggested that there were things not directly permitted by the Constitution that Congress could and would do. The Whiskey Rebellion, we're going to come back to this bit in just a bit. In 1791, Congress did pass a law establishing the bank, and the president signed it. However, to this day, Americans disagree whether the Constitution should have been interpreted strictly or loosely. A high tariff. The final part of Hamilton's plan called for a high tariff or a tax on imported goods. It would raise money for the federal government. It would also protect U.S. manufacturers from foreign competition by making imported goods more expensive. The tariff was the only part of Hamilton's plan that Congress did not pass, and that was because Southerners opposed it. They argued that a high tariff would help the North, where most industries were located, while making the Southerners pay more for the goods that they had to buy. So, checkpoint. How did Congress respond to Hamilton's plan? Again, we have the South and the North being divided. The Whiskey Rebellion. In 1791, Congress imposed a tax on all whiskey made and sold in the United States. Hamilton hoped this tax would raise funds for the Treasury. Instead, it led to a revolt that tested the strength of the new government. Many backcountry farmers made extra money by turning the corn they grew into whiskey. Therefore, they bitterly resented the new whiskey tax. Farmers compared it to the taxes, or the hated taxes, that the Britain had imposed on the colonies before the Revolution. Many farmers organized protests and refused to pay the tax. In 1794, officials in Western Pennsylvania tried to collect the tax. Farmers rebelled, burning down the home of a tax collector. Soon a large angry mob was marching through Pittsburgh like a gathering storm. The violent protests became known as the Whiskey Rebellion. Washington responded quickly to this challenge to federal authority. He sent the militia to Pennsylvania. When the rebels heard that about 13,000 troops were marching against them, they quickly scattered. Washington later pardoned the leaders of the rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion tested the will of the new government. Washington's forceful response showed Americans that armed rebellions were not acceptable in a republic. What was the cause of the Whiskey Rebellion is that checkpoint question. Looking back and ahead, George Washington set a firm course for the federal government, while Alexander Hamilton began to attack the debt problem. In the next section, you'll read about how the nation's first political parties developed. So a little bit more on the Whiskey Rebellion. Farmers thought that having to pay a tax on the whiskey produced from their corn was too much of a burden. The tax was part of Alexander Hamilton's plan to pay the nation's war debt. So, critical thinking, detecting points of view. Why did the farmers resist the tax? Why did George Washington think it was important to put down the rebellion? So, no tolerance. George Washington reviews U.S. troops as they start off to Pennsylvania to put down the rebellion. He said the farmers' action threatened both the just authority of the government and the rights of individuals. We won't pay the tax. Angry Pennsylvania farmers and militia members tar and feather a would-be tax collector, second from right. Farmers thought it was unfair to tax their liquid corn or whiskey. So at this time, it's a pretty big deal with the Whiskey Rebellion because they're like, no taxation. We're not doing this. But Washington's like, no, we are now a country. We have voted on this, and you will pay your taxes because we are a country that needs to pay their taxes. So this was a huge turning point in saying, yes, that was true before, but you now are going to pay your taxes because we are a nation that does need to pay for things. If you need to go back, review, replay any part of this video, by all means, please do that. Otherwise, go ahead, finish up your assignment, turn that in, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.